Europeans had, and Livingstone had it also, was the problem of malaria. The Africans were largely immune to malaria, but Europeans suffered from it terribly and was fatal until eventually discovered a drug called quinine. Now I did some research on quinine, and quinine is not an antibiotic. Instead I learned that quinine was like a steroid that would simply make a person stronger and thereby strengthen his immune system and make a person feel better. But quinine did a lot to enable Europeans to live in the hot continent of Africa, whereas before this it was more difficult. Now I believe that in today's world quinine has been outlawed, but at the time it was the only weapon that Europeans had against the disease of malaria. David Livingstone also discovered Victoria Falls, which he named after his queen, Queen Victoria. And I don't know if he knew it or not, we now know that Lake Victoria and Victoria Falls, well, Lake Victoria is a lake that's high above sea level, and off the edge drops Victoria Falls, and that's the mouth of the Nile River, where the Nile River forms. Then the Nile River goes on to go through the desert, through the Sudan and Egypt, and all the way to the Mediterranean. He was criticized by some people for being more of an explorer than a missionary, but he still wanted to bring Christianity somehow to the deep inside the African continent. Before his time, not much was known of the interior of Africa. The Europeans had gone to Africa and stayed near the coastline, but partly because Europeans did not like the jungle, the lions, the tigers, the poisonous snakes, the black mambas, among others, and various other kinds of venomous serpents that inhabit Africa, not to mention the big pythons, and also the amoebas, little amoebas, tiny one-celled animals that in some cases make human habitation almost impossible. Well, Europeans simply could not live in those conditions, but David Livingstone, with the help of quinine, was able to get deep in the heart of Africa. And when David Livingstone died, he said, I want my heart to stay in Africa and take the rest of it back to England. So his heart was buried in Africa. The rest of his body was taken back to Scotland, where it's just buried there. All right. The British, as I've already mentioned, conquered South Africa. Yes, British South. Oops. Before the British held South Africa, the Dutch had it. The Dutch living in South Africa were called Boers. When the British conquered South Africa, the Dutch said, no, you can't be ruler over us. So the Boers rebelled against the British, and it led to what's called the Boer War. The Boers knew they could not defeat the British Army unless it would be by guerrilla means, so they fought using guerrilla tactics, and that way the war lasted longer than otherwise would have. The British responded with equally brutal methods of warfare. Now again, folks, I've got to say this. If the British were to fight the Boers today, using the same kind of weapons they had then, except the British having 21st century mindset, and the Boers still having their 1898 mindset, I really believe the Boers would win. Why do I say that? Because in our modern world, our civilized people try to fight civilized wars, and try to fight nice wars. And the result is, we can't get the wars over with. We can't win. We have been in Afghanistan 13 years. The war against Germany, the first war, we were only there about 6 months. World War II, it took us 2.5 years to beat the Germans. So 1942, 43, 44, 3.5 years to beat the Germans in World War II. And about almost 3 3/4 years to beat the Japanese. And unless something changed, we're still going to be in Afghanistan 13 years. All right, hey, I don't like what I'm saying. If you don't like it, you're welcome to say so. I don't like it either. But again, in those days, they They fought. They took whatever means were necessary to win, including what we might call extreme barbarism and brutality. Today, we try to be nice to our enemies. Anyway, I call them Boers. Your book pronounces it Boers. I was pronouncing it the way it's spelled. Two big tribes of Africans, the Bantus and the Zulus. The Zulus are related to the Bantu. The Bantus were the main people of South Africa, and the Zulus are related to the Bantu people. And these were some of the people we ran across as we spread out across Africa. Now, the European drive into Africa is known in history as a scramble for Africa, where the European nations made a big scramble for Africa. Your book shows a battle that Europeans fighting, and the Africans are fighting with spears and shields. The Europeans are fighting with rifles, and folk, you can guess which side won. The Zulus fought alongside the Boers to try to stop the British advance, but they failed. Your book credits Belgium with grabbing the Congo. Belgium's grabbed the Congo, set off what's called the scramble for Africa. All other European, they realized, hey, we better grab how we can because sooner or later there won't be anything to grab. So when Belgium seized the Congo, the newly formed country of Belgium, other European nations jumped in as quick as they could, and they began to take what they could of Africa, again, partly for its minerals, and to justify it, they said we're going to help the three C's, Christianity, commerce, and civilization. Three C's, CCC. Yeah, among the things that Europeans want from Africa, of course, I mentioned the gold and tin, but also there's rubber, palm oil, and your book just sums it up with other valuable exports. Slavery became a big issue. All right, European countries already outlawed slavery. At least in Europe, slavery was outlawed. In the United States, slavery was outlawed in 1865. In Latin America, the last big slave country, Brazil, outlawed slavery in 1880. But then in Africa itself, some of these countries went in and made slaves the local population. Your book shows a picture of two African slaves in chains in the Congo. Supposedly, slavery was still going on in the Congo region long after Belgium left it. Now, folks, as recently as 8 or 10 years ago, slavery was still going on in the Sudan and in the Congo. And I can't say for sure that slavery has ended in either place. Slavery has been a problem that Africans have had from the beginning. I mean, if they don't enslave, if they're not enslaved by outsiders, then they enslave each other. It's been a problem that Africans have had from the beginning of time, beginning of history, up till, it appears, up until the 21st century. Your book talks about what life was like for the African living under colonialism, how the British treated their colonies, and how the French treated theirs. But one thing I do want to point out, forced marriages were outlawed as a result of Europeans. Before this time, African women were sometimes forced into marriage they probably, in many cases, did not want. Forced marriages were outlawed, which meant women could choose whom they would marry. Polygamy was largely curtailed, and the practice of female mutilation, which was still going on as recently as a few years back in some Muslim countries, that was greatly curtailed also. European missionaries told women to organize themselves, defend their interests, but not everything was beneficial. Men were often forced to work in the plantations and oftentimes left the women behind to raise their families of themselves on their own or fend for themselves. So not everything benefited the women. Women's work oftentimes increased. And your book talks about how that men began to use bicycles and eventually use trucks. The women still carried their goods on their heads. Now, I saw this when I was in Jamaica. When I was a kid, we used to try it. Put something on your head and walk around. Now, I mean, again, they learned how to balance themselves really well. I mean, I saw Jamaican women carry fairly heavy loads on their heads, and they were just as free as you could get out with no chance at all that that load was going to fall. But this practice is now known to create problems, put pressure on your skull and your backbone. Also, Victorian attitudes about female subordination did a lot to restrict women's freedom. So again, it's like everything else. In some areas, the colonization was beneficial to local people. In other areas, it was harmful. It worked both ways. Again, it was like that equation put on a board, x squared equals 16. If you remember the answer, it's a +4, it's a -4. Two answers. Part of the answer, one answer positive, one answer negative. Both answers equally valid. Okay. Now about the test, I'm almost through with the chapter. About the test. Again, if you have time, and I hope you will, look at the lectures, particularly parts that skipped. Now, this class might be favored over the other class because, for instance, this week, I've met with you 2 times. I've not met with them at all. I'm talking about the Tuesday, Thursday class. But we'll go back, learn the difference between Galileo and Newton and Copernicus. You might say, again, I've made up one test for you and one test for them, and I can't tell you off the top of my head which one you'll get. But also the philosophes, Voltaire, Montesquieu, Locke, Rousseau, some of those, and the other late 19th century scientists, Einstein, Freud, and of course Darwin. I can pretty well guarantee you there'll be at least 2 or 3 questions on Darwin, partly because I emphasize him so much. Darwin included human beings in his study. He considered human beings to be another animal, and humans were included. I'll tell you folk who are here this much about what I said about art. My daughter is an art major. None of that stuff will be on the test. I thought at least I'd mention it. It's about Picasso, Van Gogh, modernism. Again, I made up the test before I talked about this. I can't say that will happen in the future, but for this, I won't tell you they won't be on the final exam. But for this test, you won't see it. Basically, then the test covers what we talked about up to the last class. What I said in chapter 20 about today's class, it won't be there, folk. Now, you folk heard it. The folk outside, I don't care if they hear it or not. All right, any questions? Okay, I'll see you.